Hey y'all, Matthew Guthrie here. Welcome back to another episode of the 1776 podcast. On today's episode, we have on Shay Hlavaty and Justin Camp. Shay and Justin both work for the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District. Man, that's a mouthful. And basically, they're the groundwater district in South Austin and below that really govern our groundwater. And they come on and really break down exactly what they do, how the aquifers work, our springs, Barton Springs. So if you have any interest in water conservation, how our aquifers work, some fascinating information about Barton Springs, anything along those lines, this is definitely the episode for you. And I also want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor Rambler Sparkling Water. They are a local water company here in Austin that really go about doing it the right way. Really conservation-minded company. I mean, here looking at this can, they worked with HEB and the Texas State Parks to celebrate 100 years and had branding all about that for the state park system. So just a really neat company, and we're really thankful to have them on board. Hope you guys enjoy. Well, thank you, Shay and Justin, for coming on the podcast today. I'm glad to have you guys here.
Yeah, sure.
Glad to be here.
And so, Barton, let me see if I can get this right. You guys work at Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District.
Yes.
Nailed it. Cool.
Nailed it.
So conservation districts are something that I didn't really have a clue what they were or meant, and I still don't feel like I really fully understand it. So, I mean, from a high level, can y'all just break down for us, like, what is a conservation district? Why do you guys exist? And then, what do you do? I mean, I know drought restrictions come from you guys, but I think just, if you guys could kind of give us the foundation on what conservation districts are, that'd be wonderful.
Sure. So to take a step back, it's technically a groundwater conservation district, and we're specifically GCDs, also known as that, here in Texas. And so groundwater conservation districts are the only entities who can regulate groundwater. Otherwise, the rule of capture is what the state of Texas uses.
And so we have groundwater and surface water. So groundwater
Yes.
would be within the ground, springs, things like that, and then surface water, lakes and rivers.
Right.
Okay.
And so surface waters are not privately owned by the landowners necessarily. They can be managed by the state. But then groundwater, if you own the land, you own the groundwater underneath it. And the only entities that are allowed to manage that or to regulate in any way are groundwater conservation districts. And that wasn't until the 40s. So originally they put the rule of capture in place in the early 1900s. And then they were like, oh, wait, maybe we should regulate how much water people are being able to use just so we have enough for years to come and in big droughts. And so that's where GCDs came into play in about 1949.
So rule of capture, is that just basically saying hey, I'm landowner, I have the right to capture, sell, pump, whatever I want to do with the water that's beneath my land?
Yeah, that's right. Generally, the well that you drill on your property, those are your rights to that groundwater. And in 1949, when Texas became a little bit more populated and wells were being drilled a little bit closer together, then that's the introduction. One of many reasons why GCDs, groundwater conservation districts, were introduced is when two wells are close together and they're pumping a lot, they might be intersecting with each other's groundwater. So it's a way to essentially have a little bit of regulation for those landowners that do own those water rights underneath them to introduce a little bit of sharing tactic.
So how does that, the logistics of that, how does that work? If I'm a landowner and I have a private well and there's a landowner next door and then there's a groundwater district, what does that mean exactly? How does that become governed? Are y'all monitoring these wells? What does that process actually look like?
So it's definitely not simple. I would definitely not call it that.
I know that was a loaded question.
Well, one thing I wanted to note also is that in the state of Texas, there's 98 groundwater conservation districts. A lot of them might be the size of a county, but then some aren't necessarily. And there might be one GCD over multiple, or multiple GCDs over a single source of, or single aquifer.
Okay.
So like the Edwards Aquifer, we've got several that are over that, not just a single entity. And so they're all going to operate differently. Every GCD in the state is going to operate a little bit differently based on the local economics, the utilization of it, like is it mainly agriculture or big companies, and also the aquifer itself, like what's accessibility, how deep is it into the ground, how easily does it dry up, or anything like that. And so it's different for every community.
So then how are you all set up? So I mean, it's Barton Springs, Edwards Aquifer, so I'm going to assume that you're helping manage the water that goes into Barton Springs and then a certain region of Edwards Aquifer, or are you guys doing the whole thing, or how are you specifically set up?
So in 1987, we were voted by folks in Hays County and Travis County to be mandated by the Texas legislature to regulate the Edwards Aquifer within its boundaries that are drawn up based on where the outcrop of the Edwards is. And it makes this funny, out in the west, it makes this kind of funny, jagged looking boundary. And on the east, it makes kind of an L shape. And there are some pockets in there where people have decided that they did not want to be a part of the district. But where it is, those outline the Edwards Rock Formation outcrop. And what that means for us is there are several different zones of the aquifer. Starting out west, there's the contributing zone, and moving into what we know as the recharge zone. We've seen those signs on the highways.
I've seen those signs all over the place. So, I mean, what does that mean exactly?
Water coming, flowing in creeks that is crossing the contributing zone, flowing into the recharge zone, that water is entering the aquifer. So those Edwards rocks are open to the surface, and that water is creeping down into the aquifer. It's like we like to call recharge. So that water entering the aquifer, which starts off as surface water. So we do, like Shay was saying, there is a nuanced way of understanding the surface water to groundwater interaction. But once it enters the ground, that's what we regulate. And eventually we know that recharge water enters up in some of these recreational spots like Barton Springs, Jacob's Well, some of our favorite places to hang out. So not just the implication of protecting and regulating that water, but that water quality too, and like where those boundaries exist.
Okay.
And some of these recharge zones that Justin is mentioning, Barton Creek is a great one. When it's flowing, that's a really great time whenever we're getting a lot of recharge into the aquifer.
So Barton Creek itself is a direct recharge into Edwards Aquifer. And I guess like somewhere along the creek, there's just seeping back in, something along those lines?
That's correct. So
Okay.
there's a portion of Barton Creek and Onion Creek and many of the creeks that run through Austin that are crossing that recharge zone.
So I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I just wanted to put, folks who are listening, I want them to be able to be like, oh, like, I know Barton Creek.
Yeah, exactly.
I know
Spatially,
Onion
where
Creek.
are these things
Yeah,
happening?
what the heck are you talking about? Well, it's right under your nose. You might be driving over it, hiking by it. All of that's recharging to our aquifer. So even if you're not in our district, you are impacted by this, or you're impacting the groundwater that we receive that eventually ends up in Barton Springs. So yeah.
It was fascinating. I had a conversation with David Baker from the Watershed Association down in Wimberley, and he was talking to me about, I guess they did a dye test during the heavy drought, and there was water from basically Jacob's Well making it all the way to Barton Springs, which to me blew my mind. Or maybe it was that region, I can't remember exactly where, but somewhere down there the water was actually making it this far up, which I would have never put those two together. But it's amazing how connected everything is.
It is, and that we have to give love to our Trinity Aquifer, because out there where David is in the Wimberley, Wood Creek, Dripping Springs area, they're mainly dealing with the Trinity Aquifer, which underlies the Edwards Aquifer. That study I remember, and it is more nuanced than it actually hitting the groundwater in the Jacob's Well area, that dye trace that is, and making its way to Barton Springs. Dye tracing tells a lot of stories about what we can't see underground and what those flow paths and highways look like. But just mentioning before we get too far into the Barton Springs aspect of, because it's in our name, we do regulate and monitor and collect a lot of data from the Trinity Aquifer as well, which underlies the Edwards Aquifer.
Could you break that down, just the aquifers in our area? I mean, I don't know if a lot of people really understand what that means, that there's just a ton of water below our feet, you know, these aquifers, and you have the Edwards and then the Trinity. I mean, could y'all just, like, I'm a third grader, break it down for me, you know, like, what are aquifers, especially in Central Texas and Austin, you know, what's beneath our feet? I mean, what does that actually look like?
So I'll start off by saying from at least the geologic perspective, and there's a whole hydrologic cycle that goes into this, but what's underneath our feet is limestone. And that limestone happens to be a karst limestone. So you can think of it as very Swiss cheese-like limestone, particularly over the recharge zone. And over time, we're dating back to between 100 and 66 million years ago during the Cretaceous era. Texas was actually all underwater, a very warm, shallow sea. And those seas receded, and then they came back up, and they did that over millions and millions of years. And over time, little creatures and other sediments that were brought in from the sea were laid down. They were lithified, and lithified means that it goes from a mush into a solid rock. And that's what we know is our limestone now. And there's several layers. We're talking hundreds of feet. Where you're at Barton Springs, you're standing on Edwards Rock. And then about 500 feet below that, you have the Trinity.
So what's the difference between these? Is it just a different type of limestone that separates that?
Indeed, yeah.
Okay.
It's just whatever type of depositional environment meaning what kind of constituents and minerals were in the water in those warm, shallow seas at the time were being dropped to the surface, that sea surface, and then lithified. And I'll say that, you know, the deeper you go, there's a fancy word that geologists like to use called superposition. And so the deeper you go, the older the rocks are, the higher up, the younger the rocks are. And spatially, you know, here in Austin, we're pretty much standing over all Edwards Rock. And as we know, Trinity Rock is way below that. But as you move further west towards like Blanco, Wimberley, Dripping Springs, all of that rock, that Edwards Rock, has been eroded away, and the Trinity older rocks are at the surface. So that's how we kind of tell the story of, you know, where certain parts of Central Texas, particularly Central Texas, where their aquifer water is coming from, and where those recharge zones to those particular aquifers are happening. I guess in Central Texas, if you add anything to that long-winded geologic description. But I guess one other thing that I would add is I'd go back to that the Swiss cheese nature matrix of those rocks allows for the water to be able to move through quickly or slowly through the aquifer and arrive from, you know, certain caves at the surface, even small fractures at the surface, to enter into the aquifer and then eventually end up at some of our favorite springs.
So I think a lot of us have seen the Swiss cheese rocks before. You take a limestone piece of rock and it just looks like Swiss cheese with all the holes in it. What actually caused those holes?
That's a good question. And there's a couple different reasons, some of which in those warm, shallow seas, there were species of pelecypods, little corkscrew fossils that, you know, used to dig and burrow into those rocks. And then they would die when those rocks would lithify. And then over time, their shells weren't as strong as that parent limestone, so they would dissolve out. So we, almost in a way, we have those very ancient species of sea creatures to thank for, you know, the holes that we have in our rock. And then other reasons, more geochemical wise, is that some waters can hit these rocks. I guess I'll start from the beginning of this hydrologic cycle, is that when it rains, rain passes through the atmosphere collecting a lot of CO2, making it kind of a weak acid. And once it hits the ground, hits that limestone, it actually dissolves a little bit. So
what dissolves a little bit?
The limestone itself.
Oh, the
dissolves.
limestone. Okay, when the water, because it's acidic water and it hits the limestone, it's slightly dissolving.
It's
that?
reacting to
Okay.
that acidic water, and that rock is slowly dissolving. But we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, even millions of years, to create, these cave systems that we have. We have inner space cavern. We have natural bridge. In fact, they say that Austin or Texas is the land of 1,000 or more lakes. In springs. I'd substitute that with caves. We're basically on stilts here in Texas. It's just cavernous underneath there. And because of those rising and falling sea levels and that rain with the precipitating CO2 and weak acid rain, it will dissolve that rock and create those voids, caves, and even those very small Swiss cheese features in the limestone.
How interesting. And so if I was to try to visualize what the Edwards Aquifer looks like underground, if you were to do a cross-section and cut it and you're looking in, is it a combination of, massive underground lakes with giant rooms like you would expect to see in caves mixed with areas of Swiss cheese rock? What if you were to do a cross-section, what would you really be looking at? I'm sure it changes in different regions.
Yeah, I'd say all of that.
All of it? Okay.
All of that. In some places, you get big caverns. In other places, you get really tight squeezes. And in between all of that, there's a lot of faulting. We have to talk about faulting from the west to the east, the Balcones Fault as we know it.
And see, I know almost nothing on that, so let's dive into it.
So, this really goes into some college geology courses.
Let's do it. Bring it on. Whatever you want to.
So back in the Miocene, 17 million years ago, there was faulting that happened with a lot of uplift and maneuvering of just the rocks within Central Texas. And I'll make this as third grade available as possible. Is that those rocks from west to east were all shifted downwards. You can imagine if they were all on a plane, and those rising and falling seas were happening, but also this tectonic events that were really shifting the rock. They actually stair-stepped the rock downwards from the west. So if you can think about it as if you were walking from Houston to, say, Dripping Springs, you're walking up the escalator. It's kind of how, and those rocks that were at the surface, at say Dripping Springs, were all Edwards rocks. Well, those rocks have shifted down and have exposed other rocks and allowed other rocks to be lying on top of that. So, getting back to that superposition, it's allowing you're throwing in faulting. You're just jumbling up everything that was just laid down and complicating any uniformity that was eventually there. So you're losing time, you're crumbling things up, you're mixing them up, and you're creating different pathways and really disfiguring the surface that we know and what's underneath. So there's a lot of vagaries underneath our feet, but with that dye tracing, we'll probably discuss a little bit later, how to figure out those pathways. Some of that has been done to, answer some of those weird geologic time questions that, we've come across.
So I've always, as a builder in Austin, it's kind of a known thing that east of 35 you get clay, west of 35 you're basically in limestone, and that's a fault line running through here. What caused that separation? Was that just because of the plates shifting and having that fault line? Or, I've always heard that before. I don't know how true it is, but, is that just because of the plates, basically?
Shifting plates, other tectonic events, and, there's actually a few volcanic events that have happened in Austin. In fact, there's Pilot Knob, I believe, and I'm not too privy on, a lot of that volcanic stuff, but St. Edward's University sits atop an old ancient volcano.
Does it really?
It sure does.
Holy cow.
And there's even one even further east towards the airport.
Wow.
So those things were going on. They were, very much shifting the surface and the faulting as we know it.
Oh, interesting. I want to dive into dye tracing. I think that's such a fascinating thing. I've always heard about it. And so, from a high level, do you want to break that down? That's basically you're just putting in dye in one body of water or a certain area and then seeing where it comes out.
Well, I'll give the basics because
Okay.
I am by no means a hydrogeologist, and then we can have Justin dive in deeper. So dye tracing is where we basically take a bucket of non-toxic dye, but it's not like, it's organic, it's not going to hurt anybody, any animals or anything, but it's just a color. So we pour it in there, and then we're able to trace it. So not sometimes by the color, but sometimes by not the chemicals. What are my elements that it show up whenever you're testing it?
So you're actually like testing the water on the back
Testing
end.
the
to see if
water.
it's-
Fluorescence.
So we've poured into a cave or like an entrance or somewhere that we see, and then we see where it comes out. So sometimes we might have a guess of like, oh, we think it's going to come out here, and we might be very, very wrong, and it comes out 10 miles a different direction and totally different
So
area.
do y'all have people just like running around testing water everywhere? I mean, if that happens, are you
It's a very collaborative effort with a lot of geoscientists, even non-geoscientists, folks that want to get involved that can be on hand for that kind of sampling. Like Shay's saying, this could go anywhere. We're kind of theoretically thinking where this is going to go, but there's a considerable amount of work that goes in before we just go ahead and pour some dye in. Where is that cave? Where do we theoretically think it's going to go? And then, like Shay was saying, do we have the handiwork to monitor as much as we can? And after that, how do we flush it into the aquifer and make sure that we actually got it all the way down there?
Mm-hmm.
There's some work that goes into that too.
How
so-
often? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. Well, I was going to say, it's not only groundwater conservation districts that do this, but, the city of Austin, they also do it. Does USGS too assist with that, or not as much?
They can. They
Yeah.
certainly
So
can.
then it's collectively all these different organizations putting their data together over time and seeing, like, building a map of the directions that the flow is going.
Oh, interesting.
So it's not just like a one-person effort or one organization effort. It's collectively a lot of people putting in time and effort and research to build this map of where the water is going.
Are y'all able to track it 100% of the time, or sometimes do y'all put it in a location and then you struggle to find where it is?
That's certainly happened before.
I would think with the limestone that whatever is in that dye would get filtered out and would get lost in the rock.
You'd think this dye, there's about 5 to 10 different types of fluorescent non-toxic dyes that we've used. About 5 of those have been used in the Central Texas area. That it's a good question because there's some calculus that you can do to how much dye do you want to put in there. There has been occasions where there has been a dye trace where too much dye has been entered into the aquifer and it's turned somebody's well water lime green. Or the lake, it's made it to the lake, and that can create some obvious really big problems. So you want to make sure you're calculating, if not conservatively, some way to make sure that yes, you're entering the aquifer, but you're not going to have a Chicago River during St. Patrick's Day.
So
for
ultimately,
example.
y'all have a decent idea of where it's going to go. You're not just shooting from the hip and searching and.
I'd say
images.
now that's a pretty good assessment. In the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a lot of work done by a hydrogeologist named Nico Howard. We stand on a lot of the work that he's done to be able to look at the maps that he's created. And by way of that, we have a better assumption. I'm going to go with assumption on what flow paths might look like. But getting back to, you have to monitor several outlets because you really just don't know. You don't want to miss anything when you're doing a dye trace because that's not necessarily a one-time thing, but you don't want to recreate a single dye trace with the same dye because now that dye is in the aquifer, it could stay down there.
Makes sense.
So I guess I should mention that a really important part of the study is doing background and collecting background data. So you're setting out what we call receptors. They're just these activated carbon packets that can actually, when dye passes through them, it absorbs to those little packets. So we like to put those out at spring outlets, inside creek outlets that have water flowing through them, maybe 2 weeks before we actually ever do that dye trace to see, wait, is there still something in there that Nico put in 1991 that we might see in our dye trace? So just making sure that that's a qualifier for any study that we
Have
do.
you found that that's actually happened and found from that old?
Yes.
Holy cow.
So
How
I
big are
have
those carbon packets?
you know what, they look like a playing card.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
About that big. And we've visited the Kai well, that one in front of that person's front yard, which is right next to Barton Springs. Well, I'd say it's a little bit further east of Barton Springs, and which we call the saline zone. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But the saline zone means that water is not moving very fast. It's kind of sitting still. It's not moving at all. Well, before we knew that this well was in the saline zone, some dye back by the district, by my predecessors, Brian Smith and Brian Hunt, dumped some dye into this well I want to say maybe early 2000s. Let's just go with early 2000s. Well, 2018, Texas State did some sampling on the well, meaning they stuck a pump down there and pumped it back up, and the water turned out red.
Holy cow.
They were like, okay, we have a real problem here. Well, this was before my time, so I asked Brian Smith, my predecessor, who like, hey, you have any idea why this water might be red? Is there a problem here? He's like, oh, okay. We injected dye into that well, 20 years ago, and it still hasn't moved. So that kind of getting into that, there's a further east category of the Edwards Aquifer that, we discussed, the contributing, the recharge, confined, and then there's the saline further out east. That's just not moving very fast. They call it saline because it's picking up so many minerals from the rock. Being the water is picking up so many of those minerals that it's just become so saturated with minerals and almost basically seawater. So, sorry for my long-winded version.
That's great.
But that, to answer your question, sometimes those packets, whether it be the packets picking it up or not picking it up because it just didn't go anywhere.
Yeah. In that saline zone, is the limestone not as Swiss cheese-like? Is it not as porous? Is that why it doesn't move as much?
Correct. And it's smaller holes or smaller Swiss cheese, maybe not even, we're talking like micrometers of ability to move through. And because of that, the water is sitting in it and not moving through it. I guess I stated that earlier, but because that water is just like saturated in there, it's picking up and diluting a lot of those constituents within the rock, making it more mineralized, more saline.
Interesting.
And so from a basic standpoint, overall, like the Edwards Aquifer tends to have like that bigger Swiss cheese in it. And then the Trinity Aquifer typically has like smaller holes in it. And so you'll have a higher total dissolved solids, TDS, in the Trinity generally. It's not as high quality water as the Edwards Aquifer because of that, because it's picking up more of those minerals from those little bitty holes and it's moving slower. And then generally the Edwards Aquifer has a little bit higher quality water, but then simultaneously it's also more reactionary when we have rain. So that's why, when we get a rain, Barton Springs is flowing because it's gotten so much of that water from the recharge zones because of those big Swiss cheese
And it's
holes.
able to move so quick through it all. That makes sense.
But then a negative thing with that is that, if there's a bunch of pollutants, so a bunch of pesticides, herbicides, dog poop, like a bunch of stuff that's out, or like oil that's been spilled, that means there's an even bigger threat to the Edwards Aquifer and Barton Springs, and then the species that live there, like the endangered Barton Springs salamander and Austin blind salamander. So that's why you keep seeing those, environmentally sensitive recharge area for the Edwards Aquifer. It's because they're emphasizing like it's all of our job to help protect the groundwater resources and make sure that what goes here is it flowing into our groundwater resources and then ultimately Barton Springs or people's homes.
That makes sense. So I guess with the Edwards Aquifer, like, as you've said, water is able to move through it so quick, but also if you did have contaminants, it's not able to naturally kind of get filtered out. It's just going straight in basically and flowing through. And I've always heard that the Trinity Aquifer, the water quality was not as good, and now I'm starting to understand why. It's because it's slower moving water potentially. It has a lot more minerals that it's picking up, so that makes sense. So I guess in the saline area, is that they probably have to filter the heck out of their water if they want to drink that?
Yeah, but to go back to the Trinity, it's not to say that the water quality is bad by any means.
Okay.
It's just it has a higher content of dissolved solids than the Edwards water typically does.
Okay.
It's still very fresh. Still, I drink it. I live out in Wimberley. It's very hard, and so is Edwards water. But it just has a Edwards water that has a lower dissolved solid content.
Okay.
Now, but you asked about the saline.
Yes.
Yeah, so that water, nobody's drinking that water straight from the tap.
Yeah.
You're filtering that. San Antonio's doing some interesting things. And I can't say I know too much about it, but they have devices on aquifer storage and recovery, and then even desalination out
And that's
there
what I
too.
wanted to ask you about on the aquifer storage and recovery, how much y'all knew about that. It's like a new thing I've been hearing about that, from my understanding, and here I'm going to butcher it, but it's basically technology where in times of heavy rain flow, you can divert that water into pockets of the aquifer that are relatively slow moving, so that then later you could come back and basically pump that back out.
I'd say you nailed
I was
that.
about to say, that was
That was
pretty
pretty darn
good.
good.
I'm going to write
Yeah.
that down.
Okay.
I don't think there's anything more to say. I mean,
Okay.
Yeah.
So is that technology, my understanding of it, is it's relatively new, air quotes. I'm sure it's been researched for a long time, but as far as actually being implemented into projects, it seems like it's relatively new. What do you guys know about it? Has anyone successfully done it? I mean, what's the latest on it?
There are 2 permittees within our district that are in the middle of investigating that. And if by way of what I mean by investigating, that one of them has been doing this for about 5 years, and the other has kind of is still in their pilot form of it, have the wells drilled and are actively generating that data to see how well it's going to perform for them. So we are familiar with it. There are several other municipalities, even cities, that are more familiar, that they've been doing this for a lot longer. San Antonio and then Kerrville have been doing this for quite some time. But you, in your description, I'd say you were spot on, and that's exactly what we're doing. The folks within our district are doing. They are taking Edwards water that is, in high flow, moving a lot faster. We talked about those voids being bigger. Shay mentioned that the Trinity voids are smaller, and taking that Edwards water and pumping it into the Trinity. So you have to have 2 wells that are relatively close together to take that Edwards water and pump it into the Trinity, and then let that bubble, as we call it, just exist down there until it's time and need for that water to not escape like the Edwards water would. It's just kind of sitting there, almost thinking of it as an underground lake or storage tank. So,
And see, I don't know. I mean, it sounds very promising and fascinating, but also very new. And so it gives me great pause. And so something doesn't sit right with me on the whole thing, because it feels like when they brought carp into Lake Austin to deal with the hydrilla, and it's like, again, here we go, we're messing with the systems that are already in place, and we're taking water that has a certain mineral count and a certain type of mineral count to it, lack of better terms, a certain quality to the water that the certain species living down there, whatever. I mean, there's systems in place naturally that have been operating with a certain type of water, and then we're pumping that and putting it into a different system. I feel like this is another example of, where when they brought cats to Australia, now they kill all the birds. It's like, is this really, I don't know. Something's giving me pause with it, even though it sounds like such a wonderful technology. That's why I'm curious, like, who's done it successfully? What data is there? And the more I've asked, the more I'm like, well, we don't really have much yet. No one's really done this for 20 years or 10 years, and
Right.
there's just not the information yet. And so for now, I'm still very like, something just feels off with, again, I dropped out of college, so don't look at me for all of this, but like something just isn't sitting right with me. And I don't know if I'm the only one, but I feel like we're trying to mess with Mother Nature too much, and I feel like we have a long history of that coming back to bite us on a variety of things. But that's just my personal take, and so I don't know. So I'm fascinated by it, though.
certainly. I'd say that the research is definitely ongoing. So Florida's been doing this for quite some time too, and I'm not a geochemist, so I haven't looked into what that data looks like over 20 years. But I think that's a valid concern. But I'd also remind you that faulting that I was talking about, that faulting across the Edwards Aquifer is also jumbling up the rocks in certain areas where that water communication is happening with
Oh,
the
interesting.
Trinity.
So it's already essentially happening now.
It
Okay.
is. So you do have to find these viable places of the Trinity, maybe perhaps even deeper into the Trinity, where that water isn't moving fast, like we were mentioning, but that water interaction, commingling is our fancy word of using that communication of water, that is happening. But I guess I'll end with the ongoing understanding of what does, kind of leading into your biggest concern, that geochemical process look like. Are there things like harmful constituents that could possibly pop up by adding two together? I'd say this is why we're trying these things out and continuing to collect and look at that in that geochemistry data.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating, and that definitely makes me feel better about it, knowing that it's already happening in some areas. And so that's like, okay, we're working off some natural systems here, so it definitely makes me feel a little bit better. Earlier in the conversation, you had said a word, karst feature. Someone asked me the other day, like, what does that mean exactly? And again, I probably butchered it, but I basically told them karst features to me are like stalactites, stalagmite, like cave stuff. Can you give me a more proper definition for what a karst feature is?
Yeah, so it's basically a karst landscape is developed from that dissolving of the rock like we mentioned earlier. So it could be like the big caves like you mentioned, or it could be the little pores. So either one of those could be a karst landscape. And it also could be those fractures that we talked about, where the springs come out too, like all of that is part of the karst landscape. So basically it's our aquifers are karst aquifers because they're developed and the water flows through the area that was created by the dissolving of that rock.
Okay, interesting.
So karst is a blanket term for
Yeah.
all of the limestone in this area. The void could be as big as the Empire State Building, or it could be as small as your thumbnail.
Okay.
But that's all karst.
Okay.
It's all part of the limestone or calcium carbonate, as a chemist or a geochemist would call it.
Okay, interesting. So you guys have talked about, that your company, I keep Barton Springs, Edward Aquifer Conservation District, it's such a mouthful. You guys are regulating the groundwater in this area. What does that mean? How are you monitoring it? What does regulating it actually mean? I mean, what does your day-to-day look like as an organization? Could you help explain that?
Yeah, so our team, I'll break down the team a little bit. So I'm the communications and outreach manager, so that's what I focus on. And then Justin is on our aquifer science team, so they do a lot of research, the dye tracing, measuring flow at different sites and wells and everything. And we use that information so the district can make reasonable decisions based on the science that we've collected along with what other local hydrogeologists have collected also. And then we have a regulatory compliance team who is not present, and they're probably going to listen to this and be like, oh Lord, they really butchered it. But they're the ones that are really especially important to our organization, and they take permit applications that cities, businesses, individuals, just a family who wants to have a well, any of those people can submit a permit, and they have to follow certain regulations to get approved and then to have a well, and therefore to pump water from the aquifer. And so we have a bunch of different classifications of permits, which Justin and I definitely will not go into, but they're allowed to use water, varying amounts of water based on those permits. And it also depends on what it's being used for. Is it for just like home? Is it for a business? Is it for agriculture? There's different restrictions or different allowances for each of those. And on top of that, the real curveball is for the different drought stages we might be in. Right now, the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District specifically is in our stage 2 drought. That's our alarm stage. The stage 1 is basically like we're not in drought. So we're in pretty not severe drought right now, which is great because more recently, we were in stage 3 and stage 4. Mm-hmm. And stage 4 was the first time in our history that we'd ever been that low into drought. And so, stage 2, there might be some of our permittees who don't get to use any of their water right now because of the type of permit they have right now. Mostly that's for like irrigation specifically. And then some of our folks there have reductions. They could be only allowed to use 30% of what their permit is, 50%.
How is that monitored? I mean, is anyone actually checking on that?
Yeah, so once a month, our permittees are required to submit meter readings,
Okay.
and so we can see how much they've been using. They're allotted to use a certain amount each month of the year, and if they exceed that, they could experience penalties from us or have to come to like a meeting and have the board decide what to do about the situation if it's a continuously over pumping. And so, like basically we're the only GCDs are the only entities that are able to manage groundwater. So we're the only ones that can really step in and say, oh, you're using too much water, or oh, no, we can't give you this permit because of these reasons.
How does that intertwine with the right of capture, or the rule of capture? I mean, how does that law work in Texas? If you own the land, you own the water, and then you guys step in to regulate it. I mean, I'm sure there's some gray area nuance in there. I mean, how does that work for you all on the different type of permits? I mean, can you not just do you have to get a permit to get a well, or can you just call the company and do it? Or I mean, how does that work?
Well, it depends on what area you're in. So even though I said there's 98 groundwater conservation districts in the state, about a third of Texas does not have any groundwater conservation district. So we call those the gray areas. And so these could be areas that don't really have a lot of water to pump in the first place. Or it could be an area where there's a lot of water to pump, and they never wanted to have a regulatory groundwater body in that area, so they want to be able to pump whatever they want. The reason that's a big problem is because, they could be just up from another GC or just up from a GCD, and so this group is able to pump anything they want, but then they're impacting the organization and the people that rely on the GCD below them, and so that's a really big issue. Some people are being regulated and the other ones are not. I don't know, did you want to add something too, Justin?
Certainly. There's a really good example of the zones that Shay's talking about have a history with our district, and actual recent history. In 2015, there was an area in the hill country, kind of the driftwood area, that was part of this gray zone that there was no groundwater conservation district. It kind of lied in between two, one being our own Barton Springs and the other being Edwards Trinity groundwater conservation district. And a big water provider came in, or water purveyor rather, came in and drilled several wells, about 5 to 6, into the Trinity Aquifer. At the time it was unregulated, and decided, okay, there's no regulation entity out here. Let's pump away and sell the water where we'd like to, wherever we want to. And when word got out of that, it created quite a circus of people feeling like, wait a second, that rule of capture, while it may have eliminated regulation, and we could provide that for ourselves, well, a new bully is in town. Maybe we do want some regulation here for these people that are going to come and pump unregulated as much as they'd like. So there was legislation that was passed through the Texas legislature to, for our district to annex that gray zone, or white zone as some people call it. And because of that, we required that company at the time to come in asking for a permit. And we did a lot of modeling, a lot of monitoring to decide what kind of impacts that they wanted to pump would have on the people that lived out there in Driftwood at the time, which they're living on just domestic wells. It's not like, they're pumping, maybe they have a pool, but otherwise it's just for their domestic use. So these people would certainly have been affected. In fact, some of the monitoring that we did during aquifer tests, and aquifer tests is really just this company turning on their wells and leaving them on for a long period of time to see what kind of drawdown and effects that would happen to the aquifer. Well, we really did see in monitoring some of these domestic wells how much drawdown really happened. So in a way, that gray zone was actually annexed by us because there was a water purveyor coming in unregulated able to pump as much as they wanted to affect, domestic users. And those domestic users are, part of our responsibility to make sure that they have access to water, that, nobody's affecting their ability to get a resource that is very much shared.
Interesting.
And also to talk about our territory, I know we've asked about that before, like where the heck do we manage? And so the groundwater we manage, it goes from South Austin, like right where Barton Springs is, down south to northern Kyle. That's our original territory where we oversee the Edwards and the Trinity in that area. And then our southern portion, which Justin just talked about, is our shared territory. And that goes from northern Kyle down to down past San Marcos. And there we don't manage the Edwards Aquifer. We only manage the Trinity in that area. And like you said, it wasn't regulated before it was added to our territory. And the Edwards down there is managed by the Edwards Aquifer Authority. And that's a whole nother story because they're different than a groundwater conservation district.
They're based out of San Antonio.
I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit hole, but
Yeah.
another really great organization that also oversees and manages groundwater.
Okay. I've heard, I don't know if there's much truth to it, that groundwater districts don't really have much teeth to where, I mean, if y'all find somebody and they say, I don't want to pay it, can y'all even do anything? Can y'all turn off people's wells? I mean, if you had or that water company that came in and I don't know if they ended up working with you and coming to a positive conclusion, but they're like, no, screw you, we're going to keep doing it. Then what?
Another regulatory question that.
Yeah, if that's not your department, that's fine.
Where's
I'm just,
Aaron and Jacob?
Yeah.
Where is Aaron and Jacob? I guess the simplest way I can put that is that there is a regulatory way that we bring them to the table, and ask them to pay a penalty for overpumping. Mm-hmm. That when that happens, folks can come in and do just that. So I've heard that too, that we don't have teeth to really go after the people that are abusing, but we in our district haven't really seen much of that. I mean, there are the some of the bad kids out there that we have to keep reminding, but they're, for the most part, they come to the table and they pay their penalty for for overpumping and not being a part of the conservation effort that the district is trying to be a part of.
Yeah, and if for some reason they aren't able to pay or they want to come up with an alternative, they also can have a conversation with us about, oh, can we use those funds to help implement this, and this in place to conserve the water, to prevent that overpumping or to do this. So sometimes we'll work with them and be like, okay, yes, that will help you reduce the pumpage that you've been doing. And so, yes, we will allow that to happen. So luckily, most of our permittees we're able to collaborate with and work really well with. And that's where in the communications for the organization, I really emphasize that we work with well owners. We work with our permittees because we're not here just to, be the bosses and tell people what to do. It really does have to be a collaborative effort between us and them to make water conservation a reality.
Well, I think a lot of people too, I mean, myself included until recent years, just don't understand. They don't understand. They're like, no, this is my land, it's my water. They don't understand that it's connected to everyone else's water and that by you overpumping, it's affecting everybody. And so it seems like a lot of that process is probably education, just to say, hey, do you even know what's going on here?
Right.
And helping them understand. But if you ever get any trouble ones out there that just continually don't want to listen, call us. We got baseball bats. We'll handle it the old school way. Take out some kneecaps.
And to be clear,
we don't condone that.
Those are the kind of I do. Those are the kind of penalties I'm talking about. If they don't want to listen, we're going old school on them.
Conservation with a bat.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Hey, do you want to get it done or no?
Indeed. But to be clear about those permittees that we're talking about, those are businesses or agriculture. Places of business. So, those domestic well users, there's not a meter on their well. We're not governing or regulating what a single house is pumping from the aquifer. That's their business. They paid for the well. They have access to the water.
Okay.
So it's, there's like cities. I think, City of Kyle is a permittee. City of Buda is. Mm-hmm. And then there's, if you have a place of business, Wimberley Glassworks, they have a place of business.
Wildflower Center.
Those are the people that we're regulating that would typically pump a lot more than your domestic house.
Makes sense.
So,
Yeah.
So Barton Springs, I can't remember. I think it was some crazy number of millions of gallons per minute that pump out of Barton Springs. I don't remember. Do you remember the number?
I remember there being a statistic. Isn't there? It's like 40 million gallons an hour or something like that. And during high flow, I mean, do y'all know the statistics of what's coming out of Barton Springs?
Yeah, I know. We calculate that into cubic feet per second, or CFS.
So when you think about that measurement, just think of it as like a beach ball. So like
Yeah.
each beach ball is a cubic foot of water, and per second, one beach ball going is 1 CFS.
Gotcha.
And so average flow at Barton Springs is, I believe, 68 CFS. And so every second, 68 beach balls of water should be coming out of the aquifer.
Holy cow.
Lately, we've been in drought, so when we were in stage 4, it got as low as, or even before stage 4, we were as low as 16 CFS at one
16,
point.
17.
So only 16 beach balls of water were coming out as compared to that 68 average. So right now I think we're about in the 40s or 50s CFS.
40s, yeah.
So just a measurement, but continue.
That's actually a good segue onto how we actually determine drought. Barton Springs is one of our determinants, meaning if there's 68 beach balls coming out of Barton Springs, then we're okay.
Yeah.
And we have thresholds and we have methodology on how we measure this. Now, if there's, like Shay mentioned, during the summer of 2023, we had like 17 beach balls coming out. Well, that's really low. In fact, it was so low that they were having to put up plates in the pool just to keep up levels for swimmers. And so,
Oh wow! So they were having to trap the water in at
Trap
that
the
point.
water in.
Holy cow!
Yeah, you see the main area where like a bunch of water comes out, but they have the 2 sides also. They put some plates up there to only allow it to come out in the center to keep the levels up, not only for the swimmers, but also for the salamanders.
Holy cow!
So Barton Springs, being one of those drought triggers, once that gets to a certain level, we enter a certain stage of drought. And we have 2 of these drought determinants. One is Barton Springs, the spring outlet, and the other is a well in, I guess, south central Austin called our Lovelady well. And there we're measuring water levels within the well. So those, fluctuate up and down depending on, what kind of precipitation we're getting, what kind of precipitation specifically we're getting over the recharge zone. Are we getting recharge? And, in I'll start back December of 2023, we were in stage 4 drought, an unprecedented spot to be in for the Barton Springs district, meaning that Barton Springs was the pool was flowing about between 17 to 16 CFS, so very low. Based on that flow level, we can declare, okay, here's stage 4 drought or stage 3, whichever stage drought. There are implications that go with that, and there are percentage cutbacks, more gearing towards some of that regulatory compliance, in that certain stages of drought define how much our permittees, those folks that actually do have meters on their wells, will cut back their water usage. And again, we've seen a lot of compliance, particularly in this past drought cycle, that unprecedented drought cycle. And so also getting back to the Lovelady, if either one of those drops down a certain threshold, and there has been, this is very science-based, done in the early 2000s to make sure that those water levels and spring levels match up. They don't always have to match up, and they don't always do, but when things are dropping, you notice, and they can drop slowly, they can drop quickly, but when they drop to those thresholds, implications are made for those regulatory concerns. And if even one of those drops below, then drought they don't have to cross together, I guess is what I'm saying. Only one of them has to drop through that threshold. Now, to get out of those, both have to come above whatever that threshold is. And so I mentioned December 2023, we were in stage 4, okay?
And that was the first time ever in the history
A
of the
36-year
organization.
history, and that was because the Lovelady drought, or the Lovelady drought threshold, the Lovelady well had dropped below the stage 4 threshold, and so we had to declare. And then the January rains were amazing
6 inches.
and helped immensely. One thing that's really interesting, that's been interesting for me, is that, we also got about 6 inches of rain last October. And it's like, okay, why did we still decline into stage 4 drought after 6 inches of rain in October, but then we get 6 inches of rain in January and woohoo, like we managed to get back up to stage 2. That's because after the intense dry summer that we had last year, the land was cooked. Like you saw, I don't know about y'all, but in your backyards, like mine had like craters and like crispy, like it was just crispy to step on because it was so dry. Mm-hmm. There'd been no precipitation throughout for months and months, and below average precipitation for almost 2 years. And the land was just, it was like a dried out sponge. Desolate. So that rain in October like took the sponge and it fattened it up and like it got it really saturated. And so the land was primed for that rain in January. So when that January rain came, the soil wasn't absorbing as much of it, and more of it could go to those recharge zones and enter the aquifer. And so that's where we got really lucky in January with that rain, because we got above average rain, and it helped bring up the aquifer levels to stage 3. And then also we entered stage 2, which is where we are currently.
So what do you expect for the next, going into the summer? Do you think that we're heading back into drought, probably most likely, or do you think
we're still in drought?
Well, I know we're still, so stage 2 right now, still in drought. Where's your gut tell you? Are we going back down, or are we hoping for some rain, or any way to tell?
Everybody who's ever lived in Texas should just assume that when the summer comes, that drought should be paramount to our minds, and conservation of our groundwater should be paramount. I hate predictions. I can say that, with the data that's being collected right now, where we're standing right now, and then what is it, the climatologists of today are saying that we're entering into another El Nino.
La Nina.
So that means water, though, right? That's good?
Well, no. So, okay, we're getting in it deep.
Come on, let's do it.
Also, if you want to be updated on this, definitely sign up for our newsletter, because every month while we're in drought, we send out a drought update. And so Justin and I do the research on data that he collects from the aquifer, or our team collects on the aquifers. And then also we do research on what NOAA is predicting, and also other climatologists. And we, give a state of what the drought is right now, and also what we're foreseeing. And so right now, we're in El Nino. That's why we had above average rain in January and this winter that was predicted. And so that was great, El Nino for the win. But now it's predicted that we're going to go to more neutral throughout this spring and maybe early summer, and then back to La Nina, which means less rain and more heat throughout the summer, which is not exactly what we need. And also this March, we have gotten maybe a little bit below average rain, maybe we'll hit average, but we definitely needed that above average. So there's still hope for April and May. Those are 2 of our wetter months of the year, but if we continue to get below average rain, we're not anticipating a lot of rain this summer. And, I very well, again, I am not a climatologist or hydrogeologist, but, kind of like Justin said, just like kind of expect us to be in drought. So it'd probably be best if people just assumed like, okay, we were probably going to go back into stage 3 or something. Let's act accordingly. Let's, let our summer blonde show and let our lawns go blonde for the summer. Let's conserve our water in that way, because in an article I just read recently, I really loved, it said that every gallon you use is 1 less gallon for our state's rivers, lakes, and creeks, and swimming holes. And so anywhere you can save is water that we can use elsewhere and have in places that we love, and why we live here.
I think a lot of people don't connect that and don't think that the water coming out of their sink is really in Austin coming out of Lake Travis or the Colorado River.
It's a 1-to-1 ratio.
It's literally right there.
Yep.
And I think so many people don't realize that. And I think a lot of people also, you'll have days like today where it's kind of misty out, a little bit rainy, and they're like, oh, well, great, everything's green. And so for me, it kind of happened when Jacob's Well started flowing again. And there's like this huge media push of all these people so excited, like, Jacob's Well's back. And I'm like, pump the brakes. No, it's not. I mean, it's not even close to being back.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, I'm happy to see it flowing again. But I think people are just so quick to like, oh, drought's gone, we're good. And it's like, no, this is an ongoing, this has been going on for decades, and it's continued going on for decades, and it's little spurts that we kind of make it out.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where my question was coming from, was that we're most likely heading back into a drought.
Yeah, it's called the hydroillogical cycle. And then at the top of that cycle, that circle, you have your drought, right? And as you continue down the cycle, say at the bottom of that circle, you get a nice big flood and a big rain, or maybe even just a little rain, but something, that really makes everything look green again. And then maybe on the left side of that circle, you're getting back into the apathy. You're like, oh, you don't have to worry about it anymore, and then we're all the way back to drought again. The hydrological cycle is something that, I think most hydrogeologists or environmental scientists, for that matter, assume that's what the public is going to, pretty much go through. And the pumping the brakes like you're talking about, very important. And just Shay's job is one of the hardest ones, because guys like me come out and talk all these technical terms, but how do you translate that into, wait, no, we're monitoring water levels and spring flow, and this CFS is coming out, well, that's actually these amount of beach balls coming out.
That
of the
helps
springs.
tremendously, though. I mean,
Doesn't
I
it?
understand, yeah.
And she's amazing at doing that, because I am notorious for just like throwing out weird acronyms, so on and so forth. But I think the takeaway is that, Texas is, this is actually a famous quote from a Texas state climatologist, is that Texas is in a perennial drought, only broken up by the occasional devastating flood. So we can assume that, Texas is always in drought, or at least we should, to make those conservation efforts a little bit more sound.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple last questions I have for you guys. There is a spring on Town Lake or Ladybird Lake that I call Secret Springs. Not going to give away the location, but it's incredible. I mean, it's probably my favorite spring across the entire hill country. Just absolutely amazing. No one knows it's there. Even better. Recently, I saw there was a monitor, something put in there to monitor that spring flow. Is that you guys?
That's the city of Austin.
City of Austin, okay.
Yeah. And they've also known about that spring for some time, and are monitoring, water quality, but also that's a location for some of the dye tracing that's been going on.
Oh, interesting.
So I used to work for this city, and even with working for the district, I've taken those little packets, those charcoal packets that we were talking about, and hooked them up into that secret spring to monitor. And we've had breakthroughs there, and it's actually shown us some different flow paths than what goes to Barton Springs, a little bit further north of Barton Springs.
Oh, fascinating.
So yeah, that is not us, but the city of Austin is in charge of monitoring and looking after that little gem.
It's such a cool spot. I mean, you go in, you got like all the sand area, and I think it's so cool, and you can see it bubbling up through the sand, the spring water. And so I really encourage folks, if you don't know about that place, spend a solid weekend kayaking around Ladybird Lake, and maybe you'll find it. But I promise you, it's worth it. I really do.
North side
And you
or
probably
south
won't.
side.
No, I'm not saying anything.
Okay.
No, nothing. No. I will tell you that it is south of Lake Austin and north of Longhorn Dam, or whatever that other dam is. There's your hint. So good luck, folks. But
back to Barton Springs with the number of beach balls that are coming out. With Austin's growth, what does the future of Barton Springs look like? How long are we going to have 36 beach balls coming?
There is no way for us to really estimate, if or when it would go dry. The summer people, whenever we got close to 16 CFS per second, or CFS, sorry, folks
beach
were
balls.
like, yeah, there's 16 beach balls. People were like, okay, so are the springs going to go dry? When's it going to stop flowing? And we were like, we cannot estimate that. It's never happened in recorded history, and we're not the ones who are able to come up with that estimate. But right now it's doing pretty well. Like it's I think in the 40s or 50s, which puts it solidly in stage 2, which is a good place for it to be. But in years to come, there is a possibility that the springs could go dry. I think the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment recently put out an article about more and more springs going dry throughout the state, and that's going to continue to be a regular occurrence as the climate continues to change and more people continue to move to the area. And a phrase that's commonly used in the groundwater world is more straws in the ground. More people are pumping out that water, so there's going to be less water that's able to go to those springs. So it'll be interesting to see if people rally around the springs, which I think they have a lot around like Jacob's Well in the summer. People lost their marbles whenever we talked about us possibly going into stage 4 because of Barton Springs. We went into stage 4 because of Love Lady, nobody cared. But Barton Springs, oh heck no. People could not handle it.
Love Lady isn't sexy, but
It's not
Barton
sexy.
Springs is.
It is, and I think it's really the canary in the coal mine, and I think that unfortunately most people don't really pay attention to things until they have to, and I think something happening to Barton Springs, they would have to pay attention. And so I hate to say it, but I think to really wake up the general public and the folks that really aren't paying attention to this, which I would say is 95% of people, just guessing here, it's like I think it's going to take Barton Springs going dry or something that drastic to people like, oh shit, we really have a problem here, and then the rest of us can be like, yeah, like
Obviously.
I know we've been saying this. And so it's just shocking how many people I talk to outside of these type of circles that just don't have any clue or really much interest, and then you start talking to them about it, and then they think you're like a tree hugging hippie and don't want to listen to it. And I'm like, no, this is for everybody. It doesn't matter what you think about it. I mean, this is water. I mean, it applies to everybody. And so I don't know, I get heated about it, obviously. And
No,
so
for sure. Conservation is for everybody. And, the word environmentalism or environmental can really set people off, but conservation should, it's up to every one of us to be involved in that. And so even right now, for those of us who are concerned, finding ways watering your lawn is probably, I think the average household, half to a third of their water consumption is just from watering their lawn. So a really easy way to make a big impact is to reduce the water consumption that you're using for your yard alone. And then, like I said, go summer blonde. I'm all about it, even though I'm a redhead. And then on top of that, the way you vote is really important. I know a lot of folks aren't specifically talking about water, but I think in years and decades to come, people are going to start talking about it more on their platforms. And so just, people who are voting or the people who are running and have concern for the local environment and the resources and groundwater, if you're concerned about it, then those are the people who you need to vote for. And they're going to be the ones that are able to put things in place to conserve these groundwater resources and to conserve places like Barton Springs and, maybe adapt the way groundwater is viewed by the state and also managed over here. A lot of folks have been calling groundwater management in Texas the Wild West because it's the Wild West compared to a lot of the rest of the country. And perhaps by voting in particular people, we could change that and make it to where it's a resource that's here for years to come. I don't know if most folks know about this, but about a third of the Americans rely on groundwater for their water consumption, and it's the biggest source of fresh water on Earth is groundwater.
Oh, wow,
and I don't think people know much about it. I don't think people think about it, but I think we all need to.
So we have way more water underground than we do above ground as far as fresh water.
I think 30 times more. Yeah.
Wow. So I've heard before that landscape irrigation is around 60% of the water use that we have. I don't know if that's accurate, but I know it's a significant amount. But it's crazy to me when you go into neighborhoods like Barton Creek. I mean, we're doing a remodel that we just finished over there on a 12,000 square foot house. I think it's on 4 acres. And we were talking with that homeowner, and he wants to put turf in, and the HOA won't let him. And the HOA requires that they keep their yard green. So he has, 3 acres of, non-native grass to keep green, and he will be fined by the HOA if he doesn't keep it green. Yeah. And they also won't let him put in turf. And that's Barton. That's Barton. That's right there. I mean, you're really right in the recharge zone. And then the entire neighborhood. I mean, it's hundreds of homes that are 10,000 square feet plus that all have those same HOA requirements. And to me, that is like the most insane thing. Yes. I'm like, put me in front of this HOA and let me convince them you were putting turf in your front yard. I mean, it's just wild to me that there's logic like that still.
Yeah, and, local organizations are trying to make a difference in that and bring in resources for HOAs and, especially in HOAs and landlords too, because landlords might say, in your lease, you have to keep up the yard, which means keeping it green.
Mine says that, and I just ignore it.
Oh, yeah. But so it's changing that mentality, and it's going to happen over time. It's happened in California because they didn't have enough resources and experienced a drought for decades at a time, and it's going to happen here, hopefully. And so, I think different organizations like the Hill Country Alliance is targeting HOAs and creating resources of this is how you can approach your HOA to change those regulations or those restrictions that they have, or what can HOA do or what can HCA do to communicate with those HOAs to help them change their ideologies. That's a big place where we can make an impact now.
That's wonderful. Well, I feel like I could sit here all day and ask a million questions and go down all the rabbit holes, but I don't want to keep you guys too long. What else should we talk about? Is there anything else that we missed or any other topics that you guys would love to talk about?
Oh, yeah, we actually have a big event coming up. Hopefully this will be broadcasted before then. I think it will be.
Yeah.
But we have a groundwater symposium that's coming up on Tuesday, April 2nd. It's going to be down at Texas State in San Marcos. I know a lot of Austinites don't make the trek down there, but San Marcos is lovely. It's got its own little quirky weirdness about it, which, we love out here in the Hill Country. And Texas State is a beautiful campus. You've got Spring Lake close by, and a bunch of the San Marcos River. But anyway, so go early and enjoy San Marcos itself, but then join us for our event. We're going to have groundwater leaders on a panel. We're going to have over a dozen water-focused organizations there, so you can table with them and do engaging activities, get a bunch of free giveaways and stuff. And then we have also a really great keynote who's going to talk about basic hydrogeology. It's a really cool place to learn about organizations that are working on groundwater and conservation, also to see how groundwater is managed, so take a deeper dive into what we discussed today, and then also just get a basic understanding of hydrogeology for the entire area. It's going to be great. It's free. If you want to go, you can go, or if you want to register, you can go on our social media, just at BSEACD, like Barton Springs, Edwards, Aquifer Conservation District.
And you got that down.
Yeah. Or you can go to our website, bseacd.org. But yeah, you should come.
Very cool. So if folks want to get a hold of you guys or have questions, I'm guessing the information you just gave, go to the website, check it out. I know you have a lot of monitoring well information on there. That's fascinating, and a lot of cool resources on there I've seen before. Yeah,
great place to find additional. Actually, we just redid our website. It's beautiful, if I do say so myself. But basic information on wells and permits, what our drought status is. Like I said, those charts, like you said, Matthew, to see what is Barton Springs level and what is Lovelady's level right now. And also a bunch of really cool articles that we've published over the years regarding groundwater science.
Wow, that's wonderful. Well, I can't thank y'all enough for coming on. Thank you, Shay and Justin. It was very informational. I feel like I learned a ton and hopefully got some good information out there for folks.
For sure. Thanks, y'all. We appreciate it.
Of course.
Thanks for having us.